Hi there, world changers. Welcome to another episode of the How to Save the World podcast, where we'll be learning how to turn your dreams for a better world into real and measurable change. Today's guest on the show is Emily Kleeman. She is the VP of Product Management at a very interesting software company called WaterSmart. She has a degree in mathematics and a master's from Stanford University in Engineering Systems. We are going to be talking about making software and hardware that tries to get you to save water in the form of an app, using the real numbers about how much water you use. And we're going to learn from a software designer's point of view what it really takes to get people to switch off that tap. Thank you so much for joining me today, Emily. Could we start by you explaining what is the big problem in the water industry right now when it comes to measuring the amount of water that people use?
Well, we have a water infrastructure that was built about 100 years ago. So we have a problem with aging infrastructure. We have a huge amount of water, about 6 billion gallons of water that's lost every day just due to leakage. We need an estimated $1 trillion of investment in this infrastructure over the next 25 years to really build a resilient infrastructure. The problem is utilities need to use all of the data that is becoming more available in order to reach out to customers to help them use water more efficiently and also notify them about unusual usage so that they can engage with those customers, because they'll need to have that channel when they ask for rate increases to support all the infrastructure investments that'll be needed.
And how often do utilities measure the amount of water people are using? Is it just once a year, once a quarter? I mean, how can I know how much water I use just in one day?
So traditionally, utilities come around every 1, 2, or 3 months to read your water meter. Now with the rollout of smart meters, we have the opportunity to get data on a much more timely basis. So utilities can measure water use hour by hour. So we're learning much more about how people use water, and we can give them much more timely signals when we notice unusual events.
What you're saying is that just like what's happened for smart meters in electricity, that have been able to send people this real-time feedback of the amount of electricity they're using, that we're starting to see these smart meters now for water. So I'll be able to know every day or every hour how much water I'm using. And that's never been done before until recently, right?
That's right. The water industry is a little bit behind, maybe 5 to 10 years behind the electricity industry. It's also more fragmented. The AMI, or the smart meter rollout, is happening and will continue to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. And this idea of customers having access to all this data is new to the utilities and to the customers themselves, who are not used to seeing this amount of data about their water use every hour, every day.
And what's been one of the most surprising things you've seen when people go from never having any data about how much water they use, and then suddenly they have this data? I mean, what's been the most fun or most exciting thing that you've seen once people have that?
When a person first gets a smart meter, they can see their hourly use. For the typical person, their water use will peak in the morning, in the evening, and sometimes in the middle of the night if they're irrigating their yard using the irrigation timer. What's more interesting is when we're able to pull out unusual patterns of use from that data. So suppose you have a high volume use, which indicates a leak, or you're using maybe a relatively small amount of water, like 5 gallons of water, but every single hour for 24 or 48 hours in a row, then that likely indicates that there's another sort of slow leak that you never really would have known about if you're just getting a bill every month or two. And then even for customers who don't have smart meters, we're able to combine the meter readings that we do get with other information about the age of the home and the age of the fixtures that they likely have installed. And then we're able to estimate where in the home they use the most water and what changes in behavior or upgrades they could make to use less.
So what's the big thing that people need to do when you can give them this information? Do they need to shower less, water less, wash the car less? I mean, where do you see the low-hanging fruit?
The low-hanging fruit in the U.S. is typically irrigation. So we have in the U.S. about 50% in some cases of residential water use is being used for outdoor use or irrigation. I'm not talking about agriculture. I'm talking about watering the grass or the shrubs, a ripe area for production. And then in the course of a year, about half of all homes have some sort of leak. This could be a leak also in an irrigation system, which is a really common place for it to occur. Or it can be a really common issue with your toilet valve that's more of a slow running leak. So since 15% of our water supply is lost due to leaks, these are two huge opportunities that we can address with relatively low cost solutions.
So I have a 50% chance that my home or apartment is constantly leaking water, and no matter what I do to save water, it won't make a difference. So 50%, that's huge.
Right, in a year. Mm-hmm.
What changes have you seen once you've taken on a new utility and given all the residents this data?
Our early results were around water conservation, where we would send customers these home water reports that compare them to similar neighbors. And so we used social comparisons to urge the high using homes to use less water. We saw savings of about 5%. And that was even during the drought when customers were getting all kinds of messages about the urgency of saving water. That 5% was on top of our control group, which was not receiving reports. So that's pretty impressive with just sending out paper email reports. We've also seen some great results in our leak alerting feature where customers save about 10% of the volume lost to leaks than they would have if they didn't receive our leak alerts. And a sort of a side benefit is that the customer satisfaction rates also increase. So you can imagine the average customer who doesn't today find out about a leak until they get their bill and they've used so much extra water. Now we're alerting them sooner and they're so happy to receive that advance warning. It shows up in the way they feel about their utility in the form of improved customer satisfaction.
That's really interesting because one of the women I was interviewing last week, she works with a behavioral psychologist that tries to get people to save energy. And she found one of the biggest impediments to getting people to save energy was the emotional relationship that the customer had with the utility, that the utility didn't really bond with the customer didn't trust the utility. And so this gap was really affecting people's desire to save energy. So therefore, the relationship the customer has with the utility is an impediment to people being more eco-friendly. And what you're saying is that when the utility starts to give people more data, more granular data, this really helps to encourage this relationship between the customer and the utility that should therefore encourage more eco-friendly water-saving behavior.
It's the way that people expect to be able to communicate with their utility company, with their healthcare company, with their bank. Customers expect to have this digital channel where they can see their data, see their latest bill, get alerts about anything that they should care about. You know, not all utilities offer this, and it's certainly relatively new development for the water utility industry. We're seeing that change in customer satisfaction.
So the smart meter isn't a gauge that you have to get manually fitted onto your pipe. It's actually more of a software device that attaches to the existing gauging system. Is that correct?
It is a physical device. And so when someone gets a smart meter, they actually have to swap out their old water meter. But the new meter is unique in that it has this battery and it has a radio that can transmit hourly readings to a regional collector.
And who would pay for a rollout of these new meters? Would it be a whole city or a whole utility? I mean, it sounds like it's a really big job to try and get 100,000 homes retrofitted.
It's a very big job. It can take several years for them to do a complete meter rollout, sometimes by using rate increases. Even the existing meters, the analog meters, they don't last forever. So meters fail after a reasonable lifetime. So this is something, the meter replacement is something that the utilities have always had to do. But now they're faced with the decision of whether or not to invest in this smart metering infrastructure.
And has there been a lot of enthusiasm for it, or has there been pushback? I mean, what's the general level of hotness of installing them in the industry?
I would say it varies. There's certainly some more progressive utilities that already have completely rolled out their AMI meters, and they've been rolled out for some time. Other utilities, maybe because they have funding issues or they're just used to and comfortable with the way they've been doing things, have been more reluctant to roll them out.
What did you find works the best of all the different ways that you can encourage people to change? Which one worked the best?
Well, they all have advantages and trade-offs. If you want to really apply a lot of pressure, you can send what we call our red drop, which is this little animated water droplet that has a particular message for the people who we think are high users. And then you can send a happier message to the people who are efficient users. That's going to provoke a certain type of response because most people want to believe that they're good people and they don't always want to open their mail and see a frowny face, staring back at them. So we've also experimented with other types of messages. It really depends on the goals of the utility. If they're experiencing a drought and they're really trying hard to get people to conserve, they might go with a stronger message. Whereas other utilities who are just trying to get people to use a reasonable amount for their household size, they try a softer approach.
I mean, how powerful do you see the comparing one house against the average compared to these other types of messages? Did you find that it was a lot more impactful?
Yes. The interesting thing about household water use is that if you know the number of people in the house and you know roughly how large their yard is, then you can predict reasonably well how much water a typical household like that uses. So it's entirely reasonable to compare one 4-person house with 1,000 square foot yard to another one because the water use is pretty uniform. And then when we add in the data that we know about the age of their fixtures, then we can get even more accurate. Some of the objections we hear when we send out water reports are, well, I'm really not like my neighbors because I have this, the special circumstances, which makes me unique. And I think we'll always get a certain amount of people who respond that way. But we've seen that you look across the whole population, you can see savings of up to 5% by just using data analytics and behavioral science and sending people a regular reminder. So that's been pretty effective, but we also are experimenting with new types of reminders now. If we find that a home has a leak, but we don't happen to have that person's email address or phone number because they're not engaged yet, then we're experimenting sending them a print letter and encouraging them to sign up online so that they can get similar reminders like that in a more timely manner in the future. And so the water conservation is a goal that some utilities have, but others want to just drive more online conversion, and still others are more concerned about customer satisfaction. And so we're trying to address all of those goals.
When you said you can save 5%, is that 5% across the average of a whole community? Or does that mean that one particular household that really engages with the report saves 5%?
That's across the entire treatment group. So we run a random control trial when we start with a new utility where some number of homes are included in our program. They're receiving our water reports, our leak alerts. And then another set of homes is the control, and they don't receive anything. So that 5% savings is what we see across the whole treatment group over about a year. That is relative to the control group, which may be receiving other types of messages from the utility, or may be reading news. A true random controlled trial where we're comparing a treatment group to a control group, and those are the total.
Well, because I think that averages can sometimes be a little bit misleading. Maybe misleading is not the right word, but once you look closer into that community of people that have saved an average of 5%, I'm thinking that you would find some sub-communities that would have much bigger than 5%, that would be highly responsive. And then you would have another sub-community that's responsive to some other type of message. And then you'd probably have another type of sub-community that really did nothing. So, I mean, what have you seen in terms of the divide of all of these people? Have you found some super enthusiastic subgroup that's done a lot and other types that have been lazy and don't respond at all?
I wouldn't say it's a question of being more engaged or lazy. It typically has to do with the starting point. If you have a utility that has more disposable income and they have very lavish landscapes that they water a lot, and they haven't traditionally been targeted messages about the need to cut back, then they might have more room to cut back versus, say, a more urban service area that is less likely to have outdoor use, just doesn't have as much fat to trim.
Yeah, so what I think about when you live out, I live in a small apartment and I live a fairly frugal life. I think what I use in all ways. I don't think there would be any way that I could use a lot less water. I think I'm already at the bare minimum. And I think probably a lot of people who live an urban life in a small apartment, it's probably pretty similar for them. All I could really do is most people I think could do is probably just take shorter showers. Is it kind of a hopeless attempt to get people to engage in these small water-saving behaviors, like, turning off the tap when you're brushing your teeth or using the dishwasher a little bit less?
I wouldn't say it's a waste of time. I would say that in general, people don't have a good understanding of how much water they use and where they can save the most. It's an area where we haven't typically gotten a lot of data. Certainly, turning off the water while you brush your teeth is a great start. Although, if you do live in an apartment and you live in an older apartment, the odds are that you have an older toilet that might use 3 gallons per flush. And upgrading to a more modern toilet could cut your toilet use in half. For most people who live in an apartment or who don't have an outdoor landscape, toilet use and shower use is where they use the most water. The tools that we provide is this pie chart that breaks down where we sink most water. And so you might be surprised to learn that it's not tap use from brushing your teeth. It's really more about your fixtures, or maybe, doing one less load of laundry per week, for instance.
This is what's so interesting also about taking this data-driven approach more so than the educational approach that would be like the old school way of sustainability, because when we have the numbers, we can take our focus away from these fairly minute types of environmentally friendly behaviors that I think can get a lot of focus. Like, for example, in zero waste, everyone's into the bamboo toothbrush, right? But really, toothbrushes you can't even get it into the pie chart. It's such a skinny line. So all of this focus, from what I've seen, done environmental content for a long time, is telling people to do these small behaviors that don't make a big impact. But when we start installing these meters, start getting the data, what we find out that leaks are the biggest thing. It hasn't been talked about so much in the general push. That's what I see as being really interesting in moving from just trying to tell people what they should do to doing everything through measurement and real-time feedback loops. From what I understand about water conservation is that every location has a different relationship with water. Some areas have high rainfall, big reservoirs, lots of snowfall, and water conservation is just not that important to them. Whereas other areas, like where I come from in Australia, water's a really big issue. Why do we need to care about water conservation? Why can't we just get away with wasting water all the time?
Well, it's true that in some areas of the U.S. or some areas of the world, they aren't currently in a situation where they need to conserve. That can vary, right? So we're even seeing some droughts in New England, which traditionally has not experienced a lot of drought. Conditions can vary. Australia has had a lot of experience with drought, and other parts of the world, like the Middle East, are really familiar with that. Effects of climate change, we're likely to see more drought events and longer lasting and more severe droughts. So in areas that we don't typically think of as having a problem with drought, that could change in the future. Even if we move away from this issue of drought and conservation, I think there's a very general problem with aging infrastructure and leakage in our water supply. And it's compelling forever, regardless of whether or not you live in an area that's prone to drought. You're likely still living in an area where the infrastructure is aging and where there's a high rate of leakage. So these are issues that utilities need to be proactive about in terms of identifying areas where they can address leaks more proactively and open up a channel of engagement with their customers so that they can advocate for investments in infrastructure.
The job of getting all of the drinking water to everybody is a big job, right? It's really hidden. People don't realize how much goes into making sure that there is clean water with no parasites in it coming out of the tap everywhere for everybody all the time. From what I see, it's partly drought as an issue, but it's partly just a lot of effort, money, and resources that goes into getting all of this drinkable water. And it also has a carbon footprint. People don't realize that there is still an energy investment, that it takes electricity to make all this water. So can you talk a little bit more about what is actually involved in getting all this water to us and why it's useful for us to conserve that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that we tend to take it for granted because in the US, we do have an extremely high quality drinking supply in general. Of course, there are some exceptions, but that involves certainly building out the infrastructure to transport water from our river basins, or in some cases to pump it from underground wells, to run all the tests on the water and to clean the water in a way that complies with the EPA standards for clean water, and to deliver that to every household that is piped in the U.S. Vast majority of homes in the U.S. have running water. For most people, that's always been the case.
So what do you do that has really not been done before, that's really incredibly unique in the water industry?
I would say traditionally in the water industry, there have been the companies that supply the meters and the other and pipes and other infrastructure. The water utilities themselves have been concerned with testing the water, delivering a safe, reliable source of water. And then there's also the billing companies who help utilities collect revenue. What's different about WaterSmart is we really take a multidisciplinary approach. So we're using all of the data utilities may have access to, but they don't necessarily have the resources to store it and combine it and mine it in a way that helps them and their customers make better decisions. I'll give you an example. About 5 years ago, we visited a water utility that had rolled out a pilot, a smart meter pilot, where they had given a couple hundred of their homes smart meters just to see how it went. They had paper printouts of all of this hourly data, and somebody was looking through the printouts by hand looking for leaks. It was a huge ream of paper that they had to go through. You can imagine hourly data for hundreds of homes, right?
Like just numbers.
Exactly. And once they would find a leak, they would call the customer. They would, we found a leak on your property, and it could have been several weeks ago by the time they were able to comb through the data. What we're able to do is we're able to take in all that data real time. So we're getting feeds from the utility a couple times a day. We can write algorithms because we have data scientists and incredible developers on staff that can identify patterns in the data, surface those patterns, and then we have amazing designers who can help customers pay attention to the most important events. We're not just telling them, hey, you had a leak. We're showing them a picture of what it looks like and how it's so different from their past use. But we don't stop there. We actually provide a set of tools for the homeowner where they can go online and go through a set of video instructions to help them find the leak and then communicate all that back to the utility. An end-to-end solution to really a whole set of problems, access to data, and then being able to send alerts, timely alerts to a customer in a way that they can resolve it on their own.
The first ones, maybe the first company to apply all of this computing power and data science to water in a way that's not been done before. And it's exciting, isn't it, to see. What do you think is the most exciting thing that you see when you bring this data science and then you match it together with the behavioral science?
I think it's really exciting to see that it works. Our founder had this idea that we could use behavioral science to help people use less water. And, it was an untested idea. And even when we did it once, we didn't know if we could replicate it in other utilities. And then we didn't know if the results would be sustainable, across more than 1 year. And so we were able to show that that actually works. We're running several experiments to test other types of behavior change. So I've talked a lot about leak alerts, but we're also running around low-income customers and how we can help them, or people who haven't paid their bill on time, either because they forgot about it or maybe they need a payment plan or something like that. So we're able to apply this idea of sifting through the data, pulling out the insights, and then using those to help people make good decisions or change their behavior in a way that makes the whole system more sustainable.
It would be fantastic if we could suddenly have this software and this metering rolled out over the whole world. What's the hardest thing or the biggest barrier in getting this type of technology to every household, every pipe, every address in the whole world?
I think there are a couple barriers. So one is just the amount of investment that is needed to just bring our existing water infrastructure up to date. It's a huge amount. We need to, in some cases, raise water rates in order to make those investments, which is never a popular thing to do.
Like what, for example? What would one of the investments be?
So there's tens of thousands of water mains in the country that burst every year. And that's partly due because our infrastructure is, in some cases, 100 years old. So we need to be replacing fundamental pieces of our infrastructure. But then also the rollout of smart meters is another investment for the utility that'll take several years to accomplish. Those are both projects that require a large amount of investment. The other hurdle is that managing large volumes of data and engaging customers electronically or digitally is not something that most utilities have typically done. And so that requires an approach to customer service and really a change in the way they operate. So if you think about collecting hourly readings for hundreds of thousands of customers and storing them in a database and making sure the data is clean and backed up and secure, that's not something that most water utilities have experience doing. And so there's definitely a learning curve for them transitioning to this new way of doing business and using that data as a way to reach out to their customers.
So these utilities used to be like a pipes company, like or a traditional like environmental engineering company, and now they're needing to do that as well as really becoming like a software and a marketing company as well to get this whole new skill set that they didn't have.
Exactly.
And what's the hardest thing in terms of people, like getting actual people to change? I mean, you can only do so much. You can give people all the reports, all the tips, give them all the information. What's the hardest thing to get people to start actually engaging in the water saving behavior?
So I think for residents, it can be hard to get them to care about their water use. Water is relatively cheap compared to other utilities that most people use. So that makes it harder to get people's attention. Traditionally people think about their water use for a few minutes a year when they're paying their water bill. What we do is we try and now reach out to them during these key moments. So when they're initiating the service, we try and get them to enroll digitally so we have a channel to communicate with them. When we notice these unusual events is another great time to reach out to them. And then we're also experimenting with proactively reaching out to customers when they have a high bill. That's another time that people pay attention, is when their bill is unusually high. And so we can, in some cases, predict when people are on track to receive a high bill, even if it's not a leak, right? And we can reach out to them proactively so that they can take steps to either check for a leak or reduce their water use so that they don't have a high bill.
And just in regards to what you were saying before about the infrastructure investment, I'm curious if it really pays for itself. If you are going to pitch to a utility and you're saying, we can help save you 5%, and I probably even more in the future. But in order to do this, you'll need to pay for all of these infrastructure upgrades and these smart meter rollouts. Is it really financially worth it for a utility to make all of these big financial investments in their hardware so that we can have these data feedback loops so we can save water? Or are they just like 5-10% water saving? It's just not going to save us enough money for it to be worth it.
Well, for utilities that have, say, growing populations or they are experiencing some sort of drought, they need to find more water somehow. For them, the question is, how does our program compare to finding a new source of water, tapping a new underground well, building a new reservoir? And so in that case, it's pretty clear that sending out some paper or email is a lot cheaper than, tapping a new source of water. We also know that by getting these customers to engage digitally, if they sign up with their email address, with their phone number, we can send them text messages, then we're saving them other types of costs in the future. So we may be able to send them, say, their bills or other types of communications digitally, which is also a cost savings for the utility. They spend a lot of money on postage, right, and printing. And then we get the benefits of a more satisfied customer base, which is not as straightforward. to quantify, but certainly every utility sees the value of happier customers.
And what about you personally? What gets you the most excited about continuing to work at WaterSmart you think you can do over the next few years at this company? I mean, is there anything that gets you go, yes, this is why I do this?
I've spent my whole career using data to help people make better decisions. And I started out doing that in consulting and in the fields of telecom and financial services, which is really interesting. But I think the mission of WaterSmart to really have an effect on some of these large environmental issues that we're all facing just resonates with me a lot more than some of the other issues I was working on before. So I think it's rare to find a field that is intellectually stimulating.
Deep down inside, what is the most nerdiest, exciting thing about WaterSmart? Like something from like a data point of view, an algorithm or something that you're just like, oh, that's really, really cool. I really want to work on that.
We also have a data scientist on staff that does the heavy lifting. So looking for patterns in the data and figuring out algorithms. A couple years ago, he worked on an issue of trying to identify when people were irrigating based on their hourly water use, because utilities always want to know, like, how much are people really using for irrigation and when are they doing it? And so he was able to take a set of AMI data or smart meter data and isolate hours during which people were irrigating. And then we could total all of that up and determine how much the entire service area was using for irrigation. And we all were sort of wondering if it was right or not. I mean, how do you really know if somebody's using their irrigation at 6 a.m. in the morning? He and one of our interns actually drove around the service area early in the morning to check out if they were correct. And they were able to, just using a lot of computing power and a lot of data, to accurately detect these events that otherwise we wouldn't really have known about.
So that's a big step in algorithms, in computer science, to be able to do something that's really never been done before. I mean, that's a real joy, isn't it? When you can push your field, I think, to do something that hasn't been done before that makes a difference.
Absolutely.
And I think I ask this question of everybody. It's something that I'm also writing about in this How to Save the World book I'm putting together, is that it's when you can see that your work is making a difference that you get really excited. And I think that's the difference between people that are working in sustainability or environment that are feeling frustrated and angry, and the difference between people that are really excited is that they're getting their own emotional feedback loop about what they're doing, that you can go to work and you can see it in the numbers that what you're doing is making a difference every day, and that keeps the what would you call it, the virtuous cycle keeping on going. Do you see yourself in one of those virtuous cycles that will keep on getting better with this company and the work that you're doing?
I mean, I love the idea that we can apply all these tools and results that we've gotten with the set of customers we've rolled this out so far, that we could apply that on a much broader scale. You know, we currently have about 60 utility customers in the U.S. The opportunity is so much larger than that if you look at the U.S. as a whole or beyond the U.S. And we know that these problems exist all over the world. I absolutely am excited about the idea or the possibility of being able to roll this out on a much larger scale and have an even bigger impact.
Well, it seems that, I mean, getting 60 utilities on is a big step, but it sounds like that's still just the tip of the iceberg for what can be done in water conservation. If you could look back on your career in this field of data science and sustainability, and you could just achieve one thing, what would that one thing be?
I would like to think that as WaterSmart continues, that we will have accomplished our mission of changing the way people use water. That will be through a combination of just making the data about their water use more accessible and more understandable to the average person who now is relatively disconnected from how much water they use.
And where do you see the world in 100 years in respect to this issue?
Hopefully we'll be in a place where the demand for water is less than our supplies. So we're at a sustainable point of water use. We will be able to provide water for everyone, but also grow enough crops using that water to feed the growing population. Uses less energy than we do now, because we know that energy and water have a relationship with one another. I'd like us to have reached a point where our water use has become more sustainable, and that we're able to use the data we have in order to make better decisions, and that the data we have is helping us make better decisions about our water use.
In order for us to get there, we need to fund this big infrastructure rollout, like you mentioned before, right? If that's going to come true, that sounds like that's something that cities and utilities have to get behind.
Right, and we are seeing some pushes in state government to fund water-related projects. Like in California, there's been a recent push to invest in infrastructure. And we're also seeing some really positive signs from state governments who are encouraging the use of behavioral science in the water industry. So those are all really positive developments.
All right. That was an incredibly interesting conversation about water hardware and software with today's guest, Emily Kleeman. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was really wonderful to hear about all the interesting work that WaterSmart has been doing. You can watch this interview on YouTube if you look up How to Save the World, and you can also find it on iTunes with the same name, How to Save the World. Thanks again so much for listening or watching, and I look forward to helping turn your dreams for a better world into real and measurable change.